Hello, my name is Darrell Robert Chun, and in the last program I talked about the historical experience of Japan vis-a-vis the West and the trouble it's in now. No one's going to escape what's going to happen. Everyone's going to fall in their own way. The United States, Russia, China, Europe, England. China is a different story entirely because, ironically, the debt-based money that lays at the base of the West that fueled the Western expansion, taking over the East, came from China itself. But it was in a pure form when the Chinese came up with paper money. Money generally had been gold and silver. And this is true in the West, and it was true in the East. But China, which invented paper, happened to be the first country that created paper money in place of gold and silver. And they didn't do it in place of gold and silver. They stretched it. The Chinese used paper money like hamburger helper. Made it look like they had more money than they actually had. They had gold and silver reserves, but it was like hamburger helper. It had 30% gold and silver and 70% paper. Well, what China realized was this. Anytime you start mixing the two together, eventually, if 30% is good, if 70% paper is good, 75% may be a little better. And if 75% is better, 80% may not be better, but goddamn, we can spend more than we have now, and then it becomes 85, 95, then 100%, and the whole thing goes to hyperinflation, and the whole thing falls apart. China learned this from the first century on. From the first millennium on. In 1000 BC, they came up with paper money. 5 successive Chinese dynasties tried to utilize paper money, hold it, contain it, and they couldn't. Each one fell apart. And by the 17th century, the Qing dynasty passed a law outlining paper money altogether. So China, which had the only history of paper money in the world, after 600 years decided this was verboten, we weren't going to use it, it was bad stuff, and they outlawed it. Well, the same century the Chinese outlawed, I think the Chinese outlawed it in 1661, in 30 years, over in England, in 1694, 1695, the Bank of England came up with paper money on its own. But the Bank of England's paper money was a little more dangerous and a little more successful than Chinese. That's why it lasted 300 years. All right? The Chinese experiment substituted, it diluted paper money with gold and silver. The bankers in the West took this idea that the Chinese had with paper money and didn't use it necessarily to dilute it, though they did. They used paper money as a device not to stretch the royal budget. They used paper money as a device to indebt government and everyone else. Paper money was introduced in the West not by government. It was introduced by the bankers in collusion with government. The bankers went to government and said, listen, if you let us, in England, introduce this paper money as the official currency of England alongside gold and silver, we will lend you the money to pay off your war debts and loan you more money to go to war. This was an offer King William couldn't resist, and he didn't. Not only were his war debts paid off, he put together the largest navy the world had ever seen on credit, and in the 1700s and 1800s started marching across the globe. 150 years later, he reached China. China, which had created paper money itself. And with this money, with this paper money and with this advantage, he was able to bring China to its knees. In 2 opium wars, the Chinese, it was very curious. This is a great story, folks. The Chinese had it with paper money. They were badly burned, all right? And no one had done it to the Chinese, they had done it to themselves. So in 1661, the Qing dynasty had outlawed paper money. Well, when the British appeared with their paper money in the early 1800s, late 1700s, in China, the Chinese saw this paper money and they knew what it was. They knew this stuff was dangerous. They knew this stuff wasn't worth the paper it was printed on because they had 600 years of history where it showed it. So when the English showed up on China's doorstep and with their paper money, the Chinese said, no, this ain't flying. So the British, who had fallen in love with the Chinese silks, porcelains, and teas, because the British loved fine things. They had all this money. They had these fine estates. They had powdered wigs. They had beautiful women who wanted more silk. They had tea, and they wanted to drink it on porcelain. And nobody's porcelain was as fine as the Chinese. Nobody's silks were as fine as the Chinese silks. And no teas were as fine as China's teas. Not even the British tea out of India. And so the British, faced with a recalcitrant trading partner who wouldn't take their paper money, had to pay the Chinese in silver. And what happened is, and most people don't know it, for the next 50 years, China virtually emptied the West treasury of silver, because the British, who had all the money in the West and the power, were forced to buy the Chinese teas, porcelains, and silks with the silver, with their paper money, give it to the Chinese in return for the goods that they so badly wanted. Now, the British realized they couldn't keep this up. So what they decided was, we got to do something. We have to do something, or we're going to be broke. We got to, and the Chinese wouldn't trade with the West. The Chinese were sufficient unto themselves. The British said, well, buy something from us. Buy our gabardines. Well, the Chinese basically weren't into wool. They had cotton, which sufficed. They had silks for the rich people, and they didn't need to buy any wool gabardine. This suit, for example, is made from an English wool mill, one of the finest in the world at the time, and of a very high gabardine quality. The Chinese didn't want this. The Chinese didn't want anything England had. So the British had to go, well, what can we get them to buy from us? Opium. Already, opium was seeping illegally into China. Opium, which was grown in India, which was a British crown colony. So this was the perfect solution. We will get the Chinese to buy our opium and not have to give them all this silver. So they fought 2 opium wars, brought China to its knees, addicted to the country against its will, and the British balance of trade became equal. And isn't this what the West was all about? Was fair and equal? And if you listen to the West, you'd believe them. If you listen to the East, you wouldn't. But nonetheless, it is all about power. So what happened is China, addicted to Western opium, to the English opium out of India, and the United States profited by this at all. That's where all the Boston, the clipper ships were doing. They were faster, moving forth and forth, taking opium to China, bringing the goods back, opium into China, bringing the goods back, and the British and the wealth of the Bostonians grew on the back of the Chinese opium trade. Well, this started the dissolution of the Qing Empire. The Qing Empire in 1661 had outlawed paper money. They fought a battle with the British in the 1840s, 1860s, 2 opium wars, and by the end of the century were on their knees. And they came up, as I said the last time, with this communism as a model to offset what the British and the United States powers were doing. And at the end of World War II, the communist powers had taken over China. They kicked the capitalist power boys out, Chiang Kai-shek, into Taiwan, and took control of the island of the mainland of China by 1949. Well, then they put in practice this communist power structure. And as I said before in the last program, it's human nature. Power corrupts. More power corrupts absolutely, and total power turns to tyranny. And I don't care whether it's in the West or in the East, whether it's an atheist system or a church system, it does the same thing. And that's what communism did. The communism to respond to the threat of the West, put together in one power, the state. There was no offsetting religious power. There was no offsetting economic power. All power was contained in the state. And when power is centralized, you don't have just the abuse of power, you have tyranny itself. And this is what happened in China. China became an absolute tyranny. All right? But they did shift. They tried to change as best as they could to respond to the threat of the West. When I was over in China in 1976, and I first went there, all the Chinese were wearing these blue suits. Men and women, they were all dressed in blue. The top Chinese party officials had blue gabardine. The workers, the average people, just had blue cotton pants and shirts and blue hats. I mean, I remember I went over and bought myself a blue gabardine coat, just like the Chinese factory, the top boys wore. They took me to a Shanghai store number 2, I think. I don't remember it, but I walked in there and I bought my blue gabardine top, just like the top Chinese officials did, and I put it on, and somehow I didn't quite look like them, but I tried to. I thought, well, I mean, here I am. We'll make do. And China, when I was over there in the early 80s, they were working with this basically busted up system that Mao had put together that said we're all going to eat out of the same rice pot. Nobody was going to be richer than anybody else, and the state owned everything. Well, it didn't work because Marx had thought up the system out of the blue. Nobody had ever tried to make it work, and nobody could. And so, just like the Russians, the Chinese tried the same system. The Chinese version didn't work any better than the Russian system did. And the Chinese were on their way to economic annihilation until Deng Xiaoping came along and basically escaped the Chinese ideologues that were trying to make something work that couldn't work. And Deng Xiaoping came to power virtually the year I was in China in 1976 and let in the Chinese version of capitalism. Now, I want to tell you something about the Chinese. They're natural capitalists. They are natural businessmen. And it's not necessarily good, but it is a lot better than being communists, because the Chinese weren't natural communists, because nobody was a natural communist. Communism didn't even exist before capitalism arose and Marx came up with his alternative. So China then brought in state capitalism. And what happened is the Chinese government went from 1976 to 97% of the economy down to, I think, 3%, which it is today. And even the 3% it owns only as a governor on the engine of capitalism. The Chinese Communist Party still is the overseer of the capitalist system in China. But basically, China has a state capitalist system rather than a private capitalist system. And you may think that there's a lot of difference. And there is. There is a lot of difference between a state-run capitalist system and a private-run capitalist system. But the reason why there's, in the end, they're both going to go down is they're both capitalist systems. And I know that in your mind, you've been brainwashed into thinking capitalism means free markets. And compared to capitalism, capitalism is a free market. I mean, the heavy hand of a communist market of where everybody makes the same amount of money, nobody makes out except the Communist Party bosses, is just bunko, all right? And there's no freedom in a communist market. And there is freedom in a capitalist market. But the capitalist market isn't a free market. As a capitalist wants you to believe, capitalist markets are free markets where the only chip you get to play with is the capitalism's money of debt-based money. So in the end, everybody becomes a debtor to the bankers. In a free market, bankers don't have that power. In a free market, money is money, and it's not issued by banks. What people don't realize was before 1695 in England, money didn't come out of a banker's machine. It wasn't issued by a bank. Money was issued by the government, and it was basically gold and silver. When capitalism came to being, bankers took control of money. It was the first act of privatization. So when we're talking about the difference between China's state capitalism and America's, or the West's, private capitalism, we're talking about two different iterations of the same beast. The same beast where credit is used to expand the economy and debt accrues as a natural result of that credit. And in the end, the amount of debt is so great that no amount of credit can bring it under control. And this is as true in the West as it is true in the East. What this means is that the recent success of capitalism in China is vulnerable to the same excesses as capitalism is in Europe, UK, Japan, and the United States. We are at the end of a phenomenal era, an end of an era of economic expansion based on the credit of the bankers that ultimately gives rise to overwhelming amounts of debt that in the East and in the West cannot be contained and will destroy the ones who use it. Credit is like heroin. It takes the pain away. But in the end, it destroys the life itself. Now, what very few people realize is, and I'm going to explain it in a system in a way I think that even a child can understand. Capitalism is like a bicycle, all right? And the front bike is credit, and it pulls the bike forward. It goes, credit leads. The back wheel is debt. And what you don't realize is that bike has to go faster and faster and faster. Why? Because the bankers built the back wheel in such a way, the wheel of debt, that it constantly compounds. Whether the debt is at 1%, 2%, 3%, and as high as 18%, look at your credit card. All right? Look at your credit card. Some people are paying credit rates as high as 23%. In England, there are some credit cards over 30%. That debt compounds every minute you're awake, every minute you're asleep. And so that back wheel of debt keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger because it's built into the system. Now that front wheel of credit must go fast enough so that back wheel doesn't overtake it. This is as true in the United States, England, Germany, France, Greece, and Ireland, Portugal, and Spain as it is in Japan, China, Korea, Indonesia, and India. This is the fatal flaw in the system of capitalism. This is built into the system. Why? Because the ones who designed the system were bankers. And to them, it wasn't a flaw. Compounding interest was not a flaw. Compounding interest was the way they made their money. Bankers didn't make money by making something. Bankers didn't make money by doing something. Bankers made money by issuing money in the form of debt, leading compound interest by which they profited. The problems you are seeing today in the East, in the West, is due to the overwhelming success of the bankers' model, which you call capitalism. This is a system designed to benefit bankers and to indebt others. It has succeeded to a degree unimagined by even the bankers themselves, except they knew if this could spread over the world, their profits would grow commensurately. What they didn't understand is, once it spread to the rest of the world, it couldn't grow any further. And capitalism needs to expand. Once you have indebted everybody in sight, where are you going to go? Once those in sight are indebted and there's no room to expand, how are they going to pay their debts? And if the indebted can't pay their debts, the creditors can't collect their interest. Is this too hard to understand? Is this too difficult for you to get? Well, if it is, it doesn't matter. Capitalism is like the AIDS virus. You don't have to understand it to die from it. We are at the end of an era we're at the end of a system. China is the latest country to join the capitalist parade. And the end of the parade is going to end like those at the beginning. Japan jumped to the front of the parade with its aggressive moves to integrate debt into its system in a way that the West never did. Japan allowed corporations, the stocks of corporations, to be counted as money in their system, to pass as money itself in the base of the economic of their bank's ability to lend and borrow. The West never did this because they knew it was too unstable. The Japanese thought, banker-san, we've got a little thing that's better than what you've done. We've taken your system and tweaked it. We will put more leverage into the system than you even have in the West. And so they did. And that additional leverage was like a skyrocket to Japan in the 1980s that's exploded into heights where they were going around and buying up everything in the West. Remember Pebble Beach? Remember when Japanese money could buy anything? And remember when all of a sudden it stopped? Because of that little leverage that the Japanese built into the system had destroyed the system itself in Japan. Japan moved their way to the front of the bus, and now that bus is going off the cliff. The Chinese are the last one on capitalism's bus of credit and debt. And they played it a little more cautious than the Japanese, because the Chinese are even more cautious than the Japanese. Very, very conservative. But what the Chinese did, along came with them, the Chinese love real estate. They love real estate in a way that Americans can't understand. And not only do Chinese love real estate in a way that the Americans can't and the West can't understand, the Chinese love to gamble in a way that the West can't understand. And so what the Chinese did with real estate and credit and debt is explode property values to a level that the West could never understand or do on its own. The Chinese took over Hong Kong because real estate became so valuable in Hong Kong that the Chinese became so rich off of real estate, they were able to buy the British trading houses, Jardine Matheson, and the other ones with the newfound paper money that was leveraged on real estate and basically took out the British. This is how power transferred in Hong Kong from the West to the East. And now what has happened in China, their property bubble is going to makes the United States property bubble puny by comparison. The Chinese property bubble is so massive and so huge that when it deflates, China is going to find itself with tracts of empty housing, tracts of real estate that can't be sold to anybody, because nobody has the money in China to buy it when their economy is starting to implode. So the Chinese may have outlawed paper money in 1661. It was forced upon them by the British in 1848 to 1862. And now the Chinese, the British, Japan, and the United States are all going to go down on that paper ship that is taking on water as we speak. A new world is coming. It will be better. But you're going to have to learn how to swim in it.